I grew up in Baltimore, Maryland, uh, which is actually had a very good music school. It was the Peabody Conservatory. Uh, so I was in private school, mostly public school, until I was about 15, and then I went to live in Chicago, and I lived I was about 15, and I was going to the University of Chicago then. But I was very lucky about the time. I was born in 37, so after the war would have been 46 or 47, maybe 9 or 10 years later. And there were people coming from Europe, immigrants from the refugees from the war, and there were some very good musicians came, and they were all over the country. And Baltimore had its share of good musicians, and they were at the Peabody. They brought a different level of playing to the orchestras. The American orchestra today owes a lot to these transplanted teachers and musicians. So I happen to be, I think my whole life I was in the right place at the right time. That these kinds of musicians were there. And then later I went back to France. I went to France and to study music. I have done collaborations, of course, with Kronos. That's been an important one. I have a 30-plus year collaboration with Foday Suso from the Gambia. I'm working currently with a couple of Mexican, indigenous Indians of Mexico, we're doing pieces together. I've done arrangements for rock bands. I've done some arrangements for Paul Simon. I've worked with in charity concerts and things of that kind with all kinds of people, from David Bowie to Iggy Pop. I had a tremendous interest in jazz, which I cultivated when I was in Chicago, because I was in the south side of Chicago, so the Beehive was there, and I could hear, when I was there, Bud Powell was playing at the Beehive, and Charlie Parker was around. I mean, that was the days when we called it hard bop, or bebop, that was what it was called. So I listened to a lot of that music, but I knew that I was not, I knew that wasn't my, let's say, that was not my path. Though I loved the music, and I got to know a lot of musicians, but when I left Chicago at 19, I went to New York and I went to Juilliard. I wanted to learn, I wanted to work in the field of concert music. And so jazz was very interesting to me. And I think some of my favorite music has come from the world of jazz. But I was not an improviser. And I just gravitated to the, you call it the traditions of what we call 18th century European art music. That would be Vienna, Paris, that kind of thing. My training comes from that world, but my experience comes from a larger world. I was very fortunate in that I began music when I was 6, and I really started studying seriously when I was 8. When I was 6, I was just kind of playing around with some string instruments, and at my school they gave us violins and things, but I wasn't really studying very much. By 8, I had become a serious practicing music, and my first instrument was the flute. But when I got to Chicago when I was 15, I realized that what I really wanted was a larger, a deeper knowledge of instruments. So oddly enough, the piano became my alternate. I didn't pick up the violin or the trumpet I picked up the piano, because with the piano I could then look at orchestra scores, and I could study orchestra music, and I did it that way. And then when I was in college, going to a course I didn't particularly, going to a lecture, I usually would bring a Beethoven quartet with me, and I would put it in my notes, so it looked like I was studying the book, and I was actually reading the Grosse Fugue, and I found out a disturbing thing. I could read at about twice the speed of the real tempo. And so then when I hear the piece, it was much slower than I was imagining it. But you get over those kinds of things. My father had a small record shop in Baltimore. He was a car mechanic he ended up with a record store because he was a car mechanic that began fixing broken radios in cars. They got rid of the cars, then he just had the broken radios. So then he started selling records at the front of the shop. And gradually, the records took over the shop. And at the end of his life, there was one bench and one guy named John who fixed all the radios. And my father was in the front selling records. And he became kind of an expert on modern music in this way. When he couldn't sell a record, he was not educated in music. He would take the record home to listen to it. He figured if he listened to it long enough, he could figure out what was wrong with it, and then he wouldn't make a mistake of buying music that he couldn't sell. Well, so the music he took home was Stravinsky. This is the 1940s. Stravinsky, Bartok, Hindemith. He took that home, and the more he listened to it, the more he liked it. So he became the guy in Baltimore who sold traditional 18th, 19th, 20th century, particularly art music. He was particularly interested in the 20th century. And so I was working in the store from the age of 12. So I grew up in that atmosphere. And he would bring all kinds of things. He would, some summers my brother and I he got us a little storefront in another part of town to sell records. And we listened to records, and we didn't even sell any records. He just kept us off the streets in the summertime. But we started listening to Spike Jones. My dad knew who Spike Jones was. I don't know if these listeners know, but very talented musicians who were not doing concert music. They weren't doing jazz. They weren't doing popular music. They were doing some kind of wacky music that was actually closer to modern music than anything. And it's through him that I got interested in, well, I was always interested in music, but my teachers taught me, I learned, when I was playing a flute, I learned to play the Bach B minor sonata. I mean, that's what you learned to play. You did too, okay. But once I started, I got interested in let's say contemporary music, or music of today, music written by people who were still alive. I'm not talking about my great-grandfather like Schoenberg. That was my great-grandfather. I wasn't talking of, I never thought he was modern music. I thought that's what my great-grandfather listened to. I think that's probably, somehow the music world got stuck in something, but that didn't stop other people from writing new music and listening to new music. And that's why we have such like the Kronos Quartet and many other organizations that play all kinds of music. I became aware of them almost right away, that there was this string quartet that only played music of today. I don't like to call it modern music or contemporary music because it doesn't capture what they really are doing. I remember one concert I went to not too long ago, and they announced, David announced on the stage, I think it was in January, and he said, everything we're playing tonight was written since November. that's a passion, a real passion for new music. And it's partly because of their continuous interest in developing young players and young audiences. Now there are quite a few good quartets that will only play music that was written since February. It's not such a strange idea anymore, but that was started by the Kronos. When they met a composer, they asked him to write a quartet. It didn't matter. He said, well, I never did it before. Well, so you can do it. They didn't go to the most famous composer in America, like Elliott Carter at that time, and ask for a quartet. What was interesting about the Kronos was that they had no criteria which determined who the composer would be that was going to write for them. It was free of any predetermined choice. there's a lot to be said for experience. Uh, uh, I wrote my first string quartets, for example, when I was a student at Juilliard. But I've often said to my children, some of them have been composers, and one of my sons was writing music, and the younger sons, and I said, you should copyright that. My younger son, Daddy, it's no good. You can't copyright it. And I said, look, you never know when you're going to write a hit. And that's all I can say. You can try to write a hit, but you don't know when it's going to happen. Even Paul Simon says that. He didn't know when he was going to write a hit. So I would say, I think what you do is, it's a hard discipline, but to write what you can hear. It sounds easy, but it's very hard. Because if you can truly say, visualize the music in some way, in an oral way, the chances are that there's something there. But you know, there's no rule to this. There's absolutely no rule. There's no rule to how to get a good day's work done either. I mean, if I was polishing diamonds, I would know how to do it. But as a composer, I'm not so sure. I'd say a good trick is to start around 8 in the morning and work till about midnight. Then you'll probably get a good idea that day. But you think I'm kidding? I'm not kidding. That's the real deal. I was talking to a group of young musicians. They said, one of them said, tell me one thing today that I can take home. I said, I won't tell you one thing, I'll give you one word. He said, what's that? Independence. That's all you need to know. In other words, I went to music schools. When I left music schools, I was done with school. I didn't go back to school. I didn't put myself in an environment where I would be constantly criticized and railed upon by my fellow composers. I chose to have a very independent life. Now, what that meant was I had day jobs through the age of 41. But my strategy was to go out and play music as much as I could. And if I had a regular job, I couldn't do that. Teaching would have been a regular job. I didn't want to be a composer who wrote music for the university down the street, and then their composer wrote music for my school. That's the kind of thing that goes on. Independence means you don't apply for fellowships because you're not going to get them. You don't, though I got a Fulbright when I was a student, but once I was a professional composer, I got zero money. I got one gift of $15,000 from one place. But until the first money I got, free money that I didn't have to work for, I got when I was 75. And you know what? I had a great time. Because I never worried about writing grants. I never worried about who liked the music. I never worried about the reviews. I never worried about what anybody thought, because I was free of that. Being free of that meant that I might have a difficulty making a living, but that was far easier than having a difficulty of pursuing my career, pursuing my calling. My calling was to be a composer. I felt that anything that distracted from that had to be set aside. Music becomes a doorway to a lot of things. I've written 3 operas about scientists. Film music has gotten me into the films of Godfrey Reggio, which are about the environment and all kinds of issues, social issues, things that have to do with politics, and that's not the same as social, and the things that have to do with science, any of those things. That's, in a way, why theater music becomes so interesting. In theater music, I've done a lot of theater pieces that are about an opera about Gandhi, an opera about Einstein, an opera about Galileo, an opera featuring Martin Luther King and LBJ. Another opera that featured let me think. Grant and Lee. So the thing about I've used theater as a doorway to a larger view of culture, which includes science, humanities, anything you can think of. What I would say then, really and truly, why are you playing this thing? Why don't you play something that somebody else wrote? Play something by someone alive. You don't need to play me. Actually, I've said that to people. There was a group and a number of groups around that wanted to play my early music, and there was a group called Alter Ego. Very good group. They called me for years and said they wanted some music. I said, play some other music. You don't need my music. Play something new. And they insisted, and finally I gave them some music and I went to hear them, and they were really good. So it was my mistake. There was nothing wrong with them playing my music. But I wanted to encourage them to find a young composer. Don't ask the old guys, the old gals. There are young guys and young gals. There are plenty of them around.